Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week, as usual, we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris. And this week, we're going to go over a state that a lot of people have wanted us to go over. It's Michigan. Michigan's a very interesting state. It kind of gets typecast in certain ways that don't really adequately describe it as a state. It's a lot more nuanced and interesting if you look at the margins underneath rather than just looking at the surface level. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things by going into the presidential and congressional results. One thing I want to start a little bit earlier than we normally do on presidential results because it's important to kind of explain what Michigan used to be. So Michigan used to actually lean more Republican than a lot of the rest of the Rust Belt. And this is a state Gerald Ford won in 1976, in part because he was from the Grand Rapids area. He was the House representative there. It's one of the historically a very conservative city. And it voted for Republicans not only in 76, but also in 1980 and in 1984 by a very large margin. 88 is the one where things start to get really interesting because for various reasons, Michael Dukakis did a lot better in the Rust Belt as a region. In fact, he won states like Minnesota, obviously, but also Iowa and Wisconsin. But he lost Michigan by a pretty decent margin, with Bush actually outperforming his national margin. So right then and there, it seems like a little bit more of a red state than most of these other blue wall states that we've considered. But in reality, if you look at it, a few years later, you go to 92. This is a state that Bill Clinton won. And then 96, he just demolishes in Michigan. You look at this, he won by 13 percentage points. Most of the state is blue. Really good margins for him in this area. 2000 and 2004 kind of give you the typical Michigan results we've been used to for a while. A very competitive presidential election, but it did vote a little bit to the left of the country. The Senate race was very competitive. It was narrowly won by Debbie Stabenow over the Republican incumbent Spencer Abraham. And in the presidential race, this is when Al Gore managed to win by around 5 percentage points. Pretty solid performance. He did really well across the state in the rural areas. He did well in some of the suburban areas we'll talk about later. 2004 was a year that Republicans were really excited for states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, but it ultimately fizzled. You'll notice here it was, again, a 4-point victory for Democrats, 3.5 points around. Bush made some improvements in some suburban areas. It's better in some rural areas, but it wasn't enough to overcome kind of the typical areas we'll be talking about in a little bit, the Detroit area, Ann Arbor, and Oakland counties, in addition to places like Flint, Michigan, and along those lines. So 2008 is where things started to go off the rails for Republicans, at least if you look at it, the presidential result. The recession hit the Rust Belt extremely hard, and this is why Barack Obama actually managed to win every single county in the Rust Belt, or every single state in the Rust Belt. He even won Indiana, a Republican-leaning state that hasn't voted for a Democrat for years and probably won't vote for another one for at least several decades. And he just had a commanding victory of 17 percentage points in Michigan. Really an unprecedented win in terms of the vote share margin. We haven't seen margins like this at the presidential level in Michigan since 1984. And this was not a 1984 style blowout for Barack Obama. This is only a relatively a good margin for him, around a 7-point win nationally. But to see him outperform it by this much really made Republicans kind of cautious about Michigan. By 2012, Republicans really want to take it back, and they improved. They improved by 10 percentage points. But Mitt Romney faced a lot of criticism in Michigan over some stances. He opposed the auto bailout. He wasn't considered appropriately supportive of working class voters. He just wasn't a very good fit, and he wasn't ultimately able to win back even the suburban areas like Oakland County, one of the largest suburban counties in the Detroit area. And so he improved by 7 percentage points, but this is still a 10-point win for Barack Obama, a really solid performance for him. 2016 was the shocker for a lot of people. And this is Donald Trump managed to win Michigan. He won it very narrowly by around 11,000 votes, similar to what Obama won North Carolina by in 2008 in terms of we're talking about scales here. And it's worth noting that his vote share wasn't extraordinarily impressive. 47.5% of the vote. That's actually less than what George Bush won in Michigan in 2004. But he did manage to win over voters. And if you can compare to the previous map, you'll notice a lot of the state is very, very red now. A good map to kind of demonstrate the swings we're talking about here. This is from Dave Leip's Election Atlas, and the colors are swapped here. So in this map, blue is Republican and red is Democratic. And this is the trend map. So this is the map of the state as a whole. You notice most of it's blue for Republican in this scenario. And this is the swing. This is the margin shift. And you'll notice here, the shift in here is just enormous in some of these rural areas. 5, 10, 15, 20-point swings, enough to overcome Trump actually losing vote shares in Oakland County, in the Ann Arbor area, home of the University of Michigan, and then even in the Grand Rapids area, kind of the historical bastion of Michigan conservatism. It's where Betsy DeVos is from. It's a very, very prominent area for Republicans. So even despite these changes in these urban areas, he was able to improve and win. So why did this happen? For one, Democrats didn't really spend in Michigan. If you look at the totals, in fact, it was a state nobody was really expecting to be competitive. Most outlets, as of the night of the election, didn't have it as extremely competitive. I think most of them had it as either leans or likely Democratic, maybe even safe. But it was able to flip ultimately. And there are reasons for that. Republicans, as we'll explain later, have actually done pretty well statewide in Michigan in the course of the 2000s, even though federally they've had some pretty well-documented failures. A great example of where this comes from is the congressional districts. Now, it's worth noting that the Michigan congressional map is a gerrymander. There's no doubt about that. It's a very mathematical gerrymander. It's a very calculated gerrymander, and it looks, the districts look very strange, and there's a reason for that. So this is the map that we're talking about when we talk about Michigan. Michigan has 14 congressional districts right now. The districts are split 7 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and 1 Libertarian, Justin Amash, who represents the 3rd district and was elected as a Republican. So you'll notice the districts are very unusual. There's a lot of whole counties that are kept intact, but just a lot of the districts look very strange. This map right here kind of shows you the insets we're talking about, specifically with Detroit. And you'll notice the Detroit districts look very strange, especially the 9th and the 11th, really just look unusual in a lot of ways. And so this map has really favored Republicans to the point where they have won the majority of the districts in every election this decade, except for 2018, despite not winning the popular vote in any of them, with these new maps, except for 2016, if I recall right. Even 2014, the red wave, they didn't win the majority of the vote. But the districts, in a way, kind of show you the strength of Michigan and where it goes traditionally. So this is the 2012 results in Michigan. You'll notice a lot of these districts are actually fairly competitive. This district right up here, which contains the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as well as some of the upper areas of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, was the most competitive in the state. It voted Republican by only around a percentage point. The Republican won it by under 50% of the vote. This is a historically Democratic area. This is where former Representative Bart Stupak was from, a pro-life Democrat who was unseated in the red wave, and they came very close to unseating him. You'll also notice that a lot of these districts around here, the ones that contain some of the areas around here, for example, the 6th Congressional District, which contains Kalamazoo, the 3rd Congressional District, which contains portions of Grand Rapids, and then the 7th and 11th, which kind of go through the Detroit area, were also fairly competitive. The 8th Congressional District here was less competitive, but still reasonably so. And then you had a lot of uncompetitive seats. None of the Democratic seats, in fact, were competitive at all. So this is a very good year for Republicans, even though they decisively lost the popular vote for House races. 2014 shows another little bit of a shift, and this is a better year for Republicans. You'll notice that they actually did better in the Kalamazoo district, Grand Rapids. They bled a little bit in the 4th district, which was unusual. But most of them, they did a pretty good job overall here in winning. And this is just kind of the typical map of where people expected things. 2016, again, no changes at the House level. The district lineup was the same. You had 9 Republicans and 5 Democrats, except they did even better in a lot of these areas, except for 1 district. You'll notice in the previous map, they got over 55% of the vote in the 11th Congressional District, which stretches through Oakland County and some of Wayne County. This time, they only got under 55% of the vote. So that one became more competitive. And this is an important one for the next election because Democrats actually gained several congressional districts under this map in 2018. They gained the 8th Congressional District and the 11th Congressional District. Now, it's worth noting these are not the same district. The 8th district is a Republican trending district. It only voted for Mitt Romney by around 3 percentage points. And the main reason it switched from Republican to Democratic this time was because of Lansing. The portions of Ingham County and Livingston are actually very Republican. The Oakland County portion is the most Republican in that county. It just switched because of that vote. The 11th, on the other hand, is different. It's actually arguably a Democratic trending one. Both Mitt Romney and Donald Trump won the district by 5 percentage points, But obviously, Donald Trump won the state, whereas Mitt Romney lost it by 10. So relative to the state, it stayed the same, which is not good considering how it shifted. You'll notice that Republicans did pretty well overall, although they did experience a little bit of bleed in that Grand Rapids area. The Grand Rapids second congressional district went under 60% of the vote. You'll also know some Democratic areas did worse. The 5th congressional district, which is designed as a Democratic vote sink, it mainly consists of Flint, Michigan, as well as some other counties from the middle Michigan area, mid-Michigan. It shifted a little bit more to the right. The 9th congressional district stayed about the same. But overall, that's kind of where the state has been. And so I'm going to show you what Elections Daily has predicted in our most recent House ratings. We do not expect any changes in Michigan this cycle. In fact, because of the overall stability of this map, every seat, there are not any safe or there are not any lean seats or any toss-ups. So you'll notice here that almost all of the districts on the Republican side are safe, except for the 3rd congressional district and the 6th. From what I've heard from Republicans, the 6th is actually the one they're most concerned about instead of the 3rd. They have a strong candidate in the 3rd, but their candidate in the 6th, Fred Upton, is relatively moderate, and the district is just a little bit more viable of a Democratic target. You'll notice Republicans aren't really favored to get back either of the 2 districts they lost in 2018, to the 8th to Alyssa Slotkin and the 11th to Haley Stevens. We have both of those seats at likely Democratic. If we were to guess, the 8th would be a more viable target just because it's probably the one that's more likely to be more favorable to Republicans this time. But we don't expect them to really be competing that much in either. So that's kind of the situation of the congressional districts. So you might be asking, why are the congressional districts so important? Well, it's because they show a lot of that churn underneath the surface that we've been talking about, or that we will talk about later. Even though Michigan's remained fairly stable politically, leaning Democratic overall, there's a lot of stuff underneath the surface that Nick and Jared will be going into. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it off to Nick, who's going to kind of explain some of the demographic and political trends we've been seeing in Michigan over the last decade or so.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So I just wanted to start off with this map. And this is a map that shows the trend between the 2014 and 2018 governor's races. And it's a pretty good capture of the political geography of the state. You might notice that there's a lot of blue in this map, which is because there has been quite a big swing between these two elections. In 2014, Rick Snyder won by 4 points. In 2018, Gretchen Whitmer won by 10 points. This is a 14-point swing, which is why you can see a lot of blue in this map, especially around the metro areas. You might alternatively see Michigan as a state that has moved to the right, because it famously flipped between 2012 and 2016 on the presidential level, which was one of the reasons why Trump won victory. But this is a fairly good way to capture the political trends in the state as a whole. As you can see, the Detroit metro has moved quite a lot to the left. On the presidential level, it's remained more static because you're seeing a Democratic trend statewide. You mostly see it around these suburban areas. One area I particularly want to look at is Oakland County. This contains many of the suburbs of Detroit, and it also contains some exurbs up north. As you can see, this county has gone pretty reliably to Democrats, especially in the past couple of years, and it has shown some positive signs for Democrats between 2012 and 2018. As you can see, it has moved to the left, and this is an important county to watch in 2018.
It's very highly populated. It's a county, it has over 1 million people, if I recall right. It's a very, very
that sounds
county.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One thing to note when looking at the Detroit metro is that it's very diverse. Michigan as a state is not particularly known for its diversity, but when you look at the main urban areas, you can see where most of the minority population tends to live. And I added the city boundaries to this map, so you can see that most of the Black population in the state is in Detroit. Those are the dark black areas on the map. And Detroit is obviously a heavily Democratic leaning city because it is very predominantly black and very urban. And some of the areas around it show similar patterns, specifically in those bits in southern Oakland County, which is just north of the city. So cities like Southfield. Well, Southfield is the main one, but you also got somewhere like Pontiac, which also has quite a heavy minority population. If you look around Detroit, you can see that it has a very, very large mix of demographics. Now, the city that is actually nearest to Detroit is Dearborn. Now, Dearborn, if you look at this map, you can see that it is very heavily white. This is only according to the census. While the census may see it as a city with a low minority population, it actually has a large percentage of Middle Eastern Americans, which make up a large part of the population. According to the census, they're considered white, but it is important to note that this is a heavily minority city. Now, if you look outside of Wayne County, aside from the areas that we talked about in Wayne County, like Pontiac and Southfield, you've also got a few cities which are heavily white and heavily liberal, particularly in the southeastern part of Oakland County. This is one of the only areas in the county that voted for Bernie Sanders this year, while the county as a whole, as well as the rest of Michigan, voted quite heavily for Joe Biden. And then in the northern and eastern parts of the county, these are mostly exurbs, so heavily Republican areas, as you can see in the map that was shown before. And this is actually very similar to Livingston County, which is neighboring, also very exurb and very white and very Republican leaning. And another interesting one is Macomb County. This is a county which is heavily white. It's got a few patches of minority areas, but it did swing heavily to Republicans in 2016. It did go for Donald Trump by double-digit margin, which was very surprising at the time, but this is mostly because of industrial voters in the region, which mainly live in the sort of middle part. And you've also got a lot of Obama-Trump voters scattered around the county in general. But as you can see, this fits the pattern of these white working class voters who flip from Obama to Trump. And you can generally see these around the rest of the state. The state as a whole did swing very heavily in between 2012 and 2016, which is of course why it flipped. But you got a large mix of areas, most of which are white. So Eric in his section did mention Genesee County, which is home to Flint, Michigan. This was once considered the most heavily Democratic county in the state, but it did become surprisingly close in 2016. Hillary Clinton won it by a single-digit margin, and the area as a whole did swing pretty heavily for Trump. You've also got the Tri-Cities, which are just up north to it. These are mostly part of the 5th Congressional District, which Eric did mention. This was one that was drawn as a Democratic vote sync, but did come very close in 2016. It's still fairly safe for Democrats on the congressional level, but it is very much worth noting how close this area did come in the 2016 election. Because, if a similar district were to be drawn like it in, for instance, a Democratic midterm, this could very easily flip from Democrats to Republicans.
Yeah, out of all the counties in the 5th District, the only county that stayed on the Democratic column, at least in 2016, was Genesee County. The others, that's the largest county in the district, and so that was why the district stayed relatively intact and relatively Democratic, even throughout that minor change in the rest of the counties.
Yeah, and it is important. It still is important to note how that it went from a dark blue county to a light blue county. But it is still blue, and it is very much why Democrats still hold the district despite this big swing.
Mm-hmm. Now, it only went for Hillary Clinton by 4 percentage points if you look at the raw vote total.
The last area I wanted to talk about is in the western part of the state, specifically Kent and Ottawa counties. So I wanted to bring up this map quickly. It shows a fairly obscure race. It was a 2008 race for the United States Senate, which was a Democratic blowout. You had Democratic incumbent Carl Levin winning re-election by a very large margin. The reason I bring up this map is because it's very interesting geographically. You've got Democratic landslides across the state, essentially every part of the state, but there is one spot that sticks out. That is the western part of the state, specifically Kent and Ottawa counties. That's where you can see that big patch of red. Now, the reason this is interesting is because it has a large percentage of Dutch Americans. These have proved to be very different from the rest of the state, not just because of this election. It has also been the case in other elections. It was a rare bright spot for Democrats in 2016 because they actually swung to the left while the rest of the state swung to the right. Ottawa County, I believe, swung 4 points between 2012 and 2016 towards Democrats, and Kent swung about the same amount, about 4 points. Kent is home to Grand Rapids. It's one of the biggest cities in the state. We'll cover that more in depth. There's a congressional race going on there. This race might be interesting to look at in 2020, but I think that's something that Jared is going to talk about later. But if Democrats can do well in areas where Republicans have traditionally performed well, they might have a good shot at winning a key battleground state.
So Eric and Nick both did a very good job in describing the elements that are shaping up to make Michigan a potentially competitive state in 2020, even as it has historically voted more on the Democratic side. We both went into some of the congressional districts a little bit, but I actually want to go into a little bit more in detail and just describe and enumerate the various congressional districts and see how they fit into the mold and make Michigan the state that it has become politically. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you right now, here's a map of the congressional districts that are current in Michigan. And I'm just going to go through one by one fairly quickly and just talk about some of the things that make them unique. The first district encompasses the Upper Peninsula as well as the upper part of the Lower Peninsula, which is like the mitten, as we know colloquially. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is interesting. Marquette is usually the most Democratic area of the Upper Peninsula. However, in the modern day, the Upper Peninsula has swung heavily Republican. And so back even as recently as the last time Michigan had a Democratic governor with Jennifer Granholm in her 2006 victory, the Upper Peninsula voted consistently Democratic. It did so in federal races as well as in state races, such as the governor's race. In 2018, with Gretchen Whitmer's win in the state, actually it marked the first time in recent history that a Democrat won the governor's race in Michigan without winning the Upper Peninsula. So that's just an interesting facet of the first district. And so this is one of the reasons why the district has been competitive before. Even in 2016, it was decided with single digits in the congressional race, but now it's pretty much solidified as a strongly Republican district, but not overwhelmingly so. The second district, as Nick went into a little bit, encompasses a lot of the Dutch population of Western Michigan, going into such counties as Muskegon and Ottawa. Muskegon, as I'll talk about with Kent County, has actually drifted left somewhat, as is Ottawa, but Muskegon's pretty interesting as well. This district is represented by Bill Huizenga, and he won by a lower margin in 2018 than 2016. And so even though this district is destined to vote for Donald Trump in November, the margins will probably be closer. And so it'll be interesting to watch. The third district is somewhat of an outlier because even though it takes in the Grand Rapids area, at least a good chunk of it, as well as most of Kent County, because of the other counties that it encompasses, such as Ionia, Barry, and Calhoun, the district actually swung right from 2012 to 2016. It delivered to Donald Trump around a 10-point victory of 51 to 41%. That is pretty much because of these exurban counties that swung heavily Republican between the two election cycles, even as Kent County itself shifted somewhat to the left. Justin Amash is the current representative of this district. He's very well known as being one of the leading spokesmen of the Tea Party movement back in 2010. He took over the seat then in the midst of that movement. But now actually, because he has distanced himself so much from the GOP establishment and Trump, who have taken on positions that have gone against and struck a negative chord with some of his underpinnings, he actually decided to renounce his GOP affiliation on July 4th of last year, and he is now a libertarian. And so this is the only district in the U.S. that is actually represented by a libertarian, interestingly enough. The fourth district, represented by John Molinar, takes in a lot of the inner areas that are mostly rural in nature. It is a strongly Republican district, and there's not much change that we're going to be seeing here in regards to that. The fifth district, as was mentioned before, is somewhat of a Democratic gerrymander in the sense that it takes in a few areas that have historically been very Democratic, such as Genesee County with Flint, as well as such cities as Bay City and Saginaw. However, with Trump's strength among white working class voters, this district actually only voted for Hillary Clinton by around 5%. And so it doesn't really make that much sense anymore because it doesn't serve a purpose to represent minority populations. It's not a VRA district. And it's also drifting pretty strongly to the right. Even as Dan Kildee, the representative there, is quite popular. And he has won re-election quite easily in the district on multiple occasions. The sixth district is actually probably going to be the most competitive district in 2020, interestingly enough, represented by a moderate Republican in Fred Upton, as Eric was mentioning earlier. It takes in Kalamazoo and some of its suburbs, as well as the city of St. Joseph. And so it is a Republican-leaning district. It should vote for the Republican. It should vote for Donald Trump in 2020 in November. But Fred Upton is interesting. He's sort of moderate, and so you have some competing forces on both sides that are causing the district to become a little bit of an uncertainty for Republicans to hold, even though Republicans are generally favored to hold it. Now, going over to the 7th District, which is represented by Tim Walberg, takes in a lot of these southern, southeastern counties that are quite Republican in nature, as well as Monroe County, which has a lot of Obama-Trump voters. And so it's a county that voted red in 2016. And then even going up to some of the surrounding regions of Lansing, doesn't really matter. It's still a Republican district. It flipped Republican back in 2010, and it's not going to flip back really anytime soon. The 8th District, as Eric was talking about earlier, it can be deceiving because it flipped in 2018 to categorize it as a suburban district. And so you have to remember that districts, even if they look some way, there's a lot of nuance associated with them. And so this district really does just take in the urban core of Lansing, Michigan, which is a highly Democratic area. In fact, Gretchen Whitmer, the current governor, is from Lansing. So it takes in that very Democratic block of voters, and then just goes into heavily rural Republican areas such as Livingston and some of the exurbs of Oakland County, which are still highly Republican to this day. Now, going over to the 9th District, represented by Andy Levin. Andy Levin is a relative of Carl Levin, who was a previous senator of Michigan before Gary Peters. The map that Nick was showing you was actually his last Senate race, his re-election campaign back in 2008, rather. It's an interesting district because it's meant to be a pretty strongly Democratic district. It takes in some more Democratic areas of Oakland County, especially in the southeast, which have continued to trend Democratic to this day, and then takes in Warren, which is a decently Democratic city. But there are also some other areas of Macomb County that it encompasses that are more competitive and not even strongly Democratic. And so this district, even though it is a safe Democratic district, it's not an overwhelmingly Democratic district. It's not going to go over 60 or 70% for the Democratic incumbent or for the Democratic person running for president. And so it is Democratic, but not to the extent of other districts, such as the ones that are in urban Detroit. The 10th District encompasses basically the thumb of the mitten. Candace Miller, the previous representative, went to take up a job in the Public Works Commission in Macomb County, and now it's represented by Paul Mitchell, who I believe is retiring this year, in fact. And it is pretty much the most Republican district in the state. It's the only district that actually gave Trump over 60% of the vote in the state. Even these safe Republican districts out in the middle did not give Trump that margin. So this 10th district is the most Republican district. And you can see that takes in some of these more exurban and rural counties, but also Macomb County is a very big chunk of this. And this is a county that swung from Obama to Trump, and Trump won it by a monstrous 12-point margin. And so even though it's considered somewhat of a toss-up these days, Trump's performance there was considerable, and it helped solidify Republican support in this region. And then to go down to some of the other districts in Metro Detroit. The 11th District we're talking about is a left-trending suburban district that takes in some of the more traditionally Republican areas of Oakland County, as well as Livonia, which is a traditionally Republican area in Wayne County. There's a large population of traditional Republican suburbanites here, but also, interestingly enough, there are a lot of Jewish individuals who live in places like Rochester Hills. And so this is a county that's going to vote for Joe Biden quite easily, even though it voted for Trump and Romney by nearly identical margins. And then you have the 12th District, represented by Debbie Dingell, takes in Ann Arbor and is clearly a gerrymander that unites the Democratic college town of Ann Arbor, which is home of University of Michigan, with Dearborn and some of the other Democratic areas of Wayne County. And then the 13th District with Rashida Tlaib, and the 14th with Brenda Lawrence, both pretty urban districts that are strongly Democratic. And there's no indication that they're going to be flipping or be even remotely close anytime soon. Now, the last thing I'm really going to show you is just some maps that I made. And these aren't intended to be maps that could come into fruition with the next redistricting, but they just sort of show some of the interesting nuances from region to region. This is a map that I made that was supposed to be a GOP gerrymander. You can see a lot of red here. You can also see that these red districts are solidly red, mainly because I drew the 5th district here to basically extend into the most Democratic areas, such as the city of Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Ingham County, with Lansing, as well as Flint, Michigan, which is still a Democratic city. And so this district really does bring to light the most Democratic areas of the middle of Michigan. You can see here that there's still some residual support in Oakland County and Macomb County for Republicans, even as Republicans have become less favored on the national scene, especially with congressional races. There's still a lot of residual Republican support. And that's also because these districts I drew over here, like the 12th, the 9th, the 13th, taking the most Democratic areas. And so by extension of that, the other districts are going to be pretty solidly Republican from there on. Finally, I'm going to show you a map that I have, which is intended to be a pretty even split. It has 13 districts because Michigan is destined to lose a district with the next reapportionment. And so in here, you have 7 districts that won or that went for Trump, and then 6 that went for Hillary Clinton. Just a few interesting ones right here. You have the 9th district right here, which is basically Macomb County minus a little bit of Warren. And so unsurprisingly, it went for Trump by a huge margin. He swamped a 15-point victory here. Gretchen Whitmer won this district very narrowly. And John James in the Senate race actually did manage to carry this district that I drew right here. Another district I just want to show, so I don't take too much time, is the 3rd district right here. You could conceivably draw a district. If you wanted to draw a district that was Democratic leaning in Western Michigan, you can conceivably draw one that takes in Muskegon County right over here, as well as the urban core of Kent County with Grand Rapids. And because these areas, which are mainly Dutch in origin, because they are trending to the left, because they actually delivered a pretty underwhelming margin to Trump back in 2016, even as the rest of the state moved to the right, you could see this as a conceivable bright spot for Democrats and a district that they could win quite easily in the future. And so before I leave, I just want to express the fact that Democrats are really having luck in the state now because of those fast-growing suburbs. It's Kent County and Oakland County mainly that are delivering these victories to Democrats nowadays. And so Detroit, even though it is the Democratic core of the state, the population is hemorrhaging. And so there are just fewer people there to show up, and voter turnout rates there are pretty abysmal as well. And so that's why Democrats are starting to rely on a new coalition. You're not seeing Democrats win the Upper Peninsula anymore in their efforts to win the state as a whole. You're instead seeing them try to win these metropolitan areas that are growing in population and have often Republican populaces that have become more skeptical of Trump in the modern age.
Yeah, so great analysis from Jared there. There's still a lot more to talk about with Michigan, so I'm going to go ahead and show a map that I had made, which is a specific scenario, is that Michigan not only is losing a congressional district, it's also requiring an independent commission to draw the maps now, which means independent commissions are notoriously unpredictable in what they can draw. I've tried to create a fair map of what, mainly focusing on 2 VRA districts, because at the moment Michigan has 2 Voting Rights Act districts, but there has been debate over whether or not there should be 2 of them next time, because that would require splitting up Detroit. So as you can see right here, this map is fairly similar to the current one in some ways, although places like the 3rd become more competitive here. The 2nd takes in a lot of those Dutch areas. If you're familiar with former Representative Pete Hoekstra, who was the representative of the 2nd and the candidate for Senate in 2012 in Michigan, he's the current ambassador to the Netherlands. So that's kind of where that really is a very Dutch area. The 5th here, again, is a little bit more competitive because it keeps kind of that Midlands to Janice district line, and it would have only gone for Trump or for Hillary Clinton by around 2 percentage points. But you'll notice most of these other races, like Attorney General, Senate, Governor, still fairly Democratic. The 4th here would also be a considerable decline for Republicans because it keeps that Lansing area, which is, if you look at this right here, Lansing is the most Democratic portion in that area of Michigan. This one becomes, again, a little bit more competitive. It actually votes for example, Gretchen Whitmer for governor by a large margin, but also the Democratic candidate for Senate, Debbie Stabenow. The 2 ones that are the most important here, though, are the 11th, or the 9th and the 13th. So if you look at the city lines right here, I tried to draw it where I wasn't drawing out a large portion of Detroit. This is mainly theoretical, just so that, yes, you can draw multiple Voting Rights Act districts. So the 13th right here takes in not only those portions of Detroit, but also the deceivingly large white population. Much of that would be Arab American, mainly based into Dearborn. Dearborn actually has the largest population of Muslim Americans in the United States. Metro Detroit has a very large portion of Arab Americans. So many of these people, even though they show up as white, if the census were to reflect a new designation like a Middle Eastern or North African or MENA, as some have called it, this would definitely be much more of a VRA district on paper than, or in practice, than right here, because a lot of that white population is actually Arab or Middle Eastern, and they're classified as white, but they're not white in the same sense as a lot of the rest of Detroit. And then the 9th right here goes through some areas like Pontiac and also areas of Western Detroit. And this also, again, it's a VRA district by a large margin, around 10 percentage points. So it is possible that that even though Michigan loses a congressional district, that this is going to retain their 2 VRA districts. For comparison here, the 11th would actually go from being predominantly based in Oakland County to mostly being based in Macomb, and it would be very competitive if you look right here. Trump would have won it by around 5 points. Richard Whitmer would have won it by around 8. Same with Debbie Stabenow, and the Democratic Attorney General candidate would have won it as well. With again most of northern portion of the county going into the northern portion into the 10th district. There's a few other things to note with Michigan as well. One thing I don't think people give enough credit for is that Michigan is actually very idiosyncratic, and that even though it's has been fairly Democratic consistently, not just at the Senate level or the presidential level, but at the Senate as well. It's not had a Republican senator elected this century. It's actually been fairly Republican in everything else. Democrats, if you look at the state legislative composition, the last time they had the legislature was in the 80s, 1983. Since the 80s, there's only been 3 Democratic governors, James Blanchard, Jennifer Granholm, and Gretchen Whitmer. Republicans have actually held most statewide offices this century. They've held the legislature for all but two cycles, and granted, some of that's due to gerrymandering. But gerrymandering alone isn't entirely indicative of what we're talking about here due to the presence of ancestral Democrats up and down the ticket in Michigan. So really, this is a much more competitive state in a lot of different ways than people would like to talk about. Finally, one last race I want to discuss is the Senate election. So Michigan obviously has a competitive presidential race this cycle, although the degree to how competitive it is seems to be a little bit different from 2016. It also has a competitive Senate race, or at least a race we thought would be competitive. So in 2018, Debbie Stabenow, who had won decisive victories in both 2006 and 2012, easily dispatching Republican candidates, she was up for re-election, and she was projected to win. Most outlets had the race as likely or safe Democratic. In the end, she actually only won it by around 7 percentage points over Republican John James. Now, you'll notice the map here that there are some areas that shifted. For example, Kent County, home of Grand Rapids here, although it voted for Republican Pete Hoekstra in 2012, it actually voted for Stabenow in 2018. But James did a respectable performance in a race most people had written him off from. He did pretty well in Wayne County and some other areas across the state, underperformed in a few rural communities. So obviously he did very well in a race that nobody thought would be particularly competitive. And so going into 2020, he's going up against Gary Peters, who is the Democratic Senate candidate. Peters is kind of an off-ball candidate. He's a survivor. He's won multiple races that he really had no business winning, including one of the Voting Rights Act districts in Detroit. And in 2014, he actually kind of lucked his way into the Senate when the Republican recruit, Terry Lynn Land, basically imploded in the middle of her campaign. She had a meltdown during a press conference where she said that she couldn't handle the questioning. She basically went missing in action for most of the campaign. And Republicans rode off the Senate race, even though they won, obviously, in most of the congressional districts, both houses of the legislature and the gubernatorial race by narrow margins. He won the state by a very large 13-point margin. But he suffered from low name recognition, which is why Republicans initially thought this race would be very competitive. But if you look at how people are rating the race at the moment, you look at kind of these ratings here, most of them have the race that either leans Democratic, likely, or in the case of Niskanen, safe. At Elections Daily, we have the race at likely Democratic. So why is this race at likely Democratic? Well, it's mainly because of the polling. Even though Gary Peters isn't a top-tier Senate candidate or a top-tier senator, John James has really failed to make up for his increase in name identification and high name identification, and has instead run he's fundraised very well, but it's not really made a dent. Gary Peters has around a 9 to 10 point lead in most polls at the moment. It's decreased a little bit, but this is not really the slam dunk race Republicans were kind of hoping. Initially, it seemed like Republicans were wishing that John James would outrun Trump. This time, it seemed like he's running somewhere behind Trump in Michigan. So kind of missed opportunity on the Republican side, although obviously the race could be different. John James did overperform polling in 2018. So that's kind of the Republican hope this time. But with that, we're going to kind of close off this episode on Michigan. We hope you've learned a lot about the state. It's even though it's a fairly easy state to categorize as a Rust Belt state that went for Republicans in 2016. Below the surface, it's a much more competitive and fascinating state than really that upper level description kind of gives it. So where can we find you guys on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter at JStonePolitics.
You can find me on Twitter at TossUpReport.
And you can find me on Twitter at DE Cunningham too. You can also find us on Twitter at elections_daily. And our website is elections-daily.com. We're not only doing articles that we've written, but also we have podcasts and live election coverage and all sorts of other things that we're doing on these accounts. So definitely go check them out. We're nearing 3,000 followers on Twitter, so you have an opportunity to be the 3,000th follower for the listeners of the show. So definitely go give us a follow on there. But yeah, thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you on next week's edition of The Map Room.